in December 1972. The nearest hospital. You need a rocket that can reliably launch, a crew capsule that survives re-entry, a lunar lander that can reach the moon, land, and get back off, spacesuits that keep astronauts alive on the surface, and the raw human competency, the experience to pull all of it together without fatal mistakes. In 1969, NASA had all five. It took 8 years, 2 full programs, and roughly 20 crewed missions to build that foundation before Armstrong stepped off the ladder. When NASA announced Artemis III as a crewed lunar landing, here's what they actually had: a rocket, the Space Launch System, that had launched once. Uncrewed, a crew capsule Orion that had flown once. Uncrewed, and come back with a heat shield that behaved in ways the engineers hadn't predicted. A Luna, AR lander, SpaceX's Starship, that had never flown humans, never operated near the moon, and required a refueling process in orbit that had never been demonstrated at scale. Spacesuits built by Axiom Space that needed a redesign to meet NASA's own minimum life support requirements. And a launch cadence, the pace at which NASA actually flies, that was the slowest in the agency's entire history. Not one of those 5 pillars was fully standing. And yet, the mission was being announced, promoted, and scheduled as though they were. Here is a number that should stop you cold. In the 1960s, across Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, NASA's average gap between launches was roughly 3 months. Apollo 7 splashed down in October 1968. Apollo 8 launched 9 weeks later and became the first crewed mission to orbit the moon. 9 weeks. That pace wasn't just ambition, it was survival. You had to fly often to learn fast enough to stay alive. Now, here's the Artemis number. Artemis 1 launched in November 2022. The gap to Artemis, 2 years. And under the original plan, Artemis 3 wouldn't fly until approximately 3 years after that. Jared Isaacman, NASA new administrator, called it EA, exactly what it is. By far the lowest launch cadence in the history of America's space program. Not just slower than Apollo, slower than every program NASA has ever run. And here's why that matters beyond simple impatience. When you launch once every 3 years, your engineers forget things. Not the big things, not the physics, the small things. The specific behavior of a seal under cryogenic pressure. The sequence of decisions you make at 2 a.m. when a reading is slightly off nominal and you have to judge whether to scrub or continue. The proof that this was already happening showed up in the most embarrassing possible way. The same hydrogen leak issues that caused delays during Artemis 1 launch preparations appeared again during Artemis 2. Helium flow problems in Artemis. Helium flow problems in Artemis 2. Same categories of failure, years apart, because the team never launched often enough to build the competency to stop repeating them. Isaacman's words were precise. Skills atrophy without repetition. He also said this: when you experience and say some of the same issues between launches, you've probably got to take a close look at your process for remediation. Are you truly getting the technical root cause, or are you getting close to it? That is a very careful way of saying, we have been fixing symptoms instead of problems. And the slow cadence is why we never noticed. Now we get to the part of this story that is genuinely extraordinary. NASA doesn't own a lunar lander for Artemis. The agency contracted out the entire problem to commercial providers under the Human Landing System program. SpaceX won the first contract with their Starship lunar variant. Blue Origin won a second contract with their Blue Moon lander. The logic was defensible. Commercial competition drives innovation, reduces cost, and can move faster than traditional government procurement. The problem: neither vehicle was ready, and the original Artemis III schedule treated their readiness as a certainty rather than a question. Let's start with SpaceX's Starship. The scale of this vehicle is genuinely hard to process. Former NASA astronaut Steve Robinson, when shown a 1/200th scale model comparison between Starship and the Orion capsule during AL. I've broadcast described the difference as holding a toy rocket next to a real building. The payload capacity changes everything about what's possible on the moon. The amount of equipment, supplies, and crew it could deliver in a single mission is transformational. But getting Starship to the moon involves solving a problem that has never been solved in practice. Starship cannot carry enough propellant to reach the moon in a single launch. To get there, it has to be refueled in orbit. That means launching a chain of Starship tanker missions in rapid succession, each one transferring thousands of tons of super-chilled liquid oxygen and liquid methane through connections in the vacuum of space. The propellants have to stay cold. Cryogenic fluids behave unpredictably. In zero gravity, they don't simply flow to the outlet the way they do on the ground. The transfers have to happen within a tight window. Multiple tankers have to execute without failure, one after another, before the crewed vehicle can leave for the moon. The Government Accountability Office flagged this specifically in their oversight report, describing it as a highly experimental process that has yet to be fully asterisk, and it doesn't end there. After the tankers do their work in low Earth orbit, the lander has to travel to a near rectilinear halo orbit around the moon where Orion would be waiting. And then the cryogenic transfer process has to work again, in a completely different orbital environment, further from Earth, with no margin for system failures. Blue Origin's Blue Moon faces its own version of the same problem. The same cryogenic fluid challenges, the same unproven orbital mechanics. Now here's what Scott Manley, one of the most technically rigorous analysts covering the space program, found when he looked closely at what hardware actually existed. As of early 2025, there was nothing visible at SpaceX's Starbase facility that looked like the beginning of a lunar Starship. The vehicle designed to land humans on the moon had not entered production in any visible way. Blue Origin's Mark 1 lander, the smaller, uncrewed version, had only recently completed testing and was being prepared for a payload delivery mission. The Mark 2, the larger human-rated version actually designed to carry crew to the lunar surface, had not been tested at all. What NASA and the public had been and shown was renders, mock-ups, concept art. Manley's framing was precise. The biggest space race right now is not between America and China. It's between SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Artemis III. The lander wasn't late because of a sudden technical surprise. It was late because the program had been built around a timeline that assumed hardware readiness nobody had actually confirmed. 2 more failures, both known, both quietly accumulated. The spacesuits first. Axiom Space was contracted to build the XEVA suits for Artemis new suits designed specifically for the lunar South Pole, where permanently shadowed craters reach temperatures of -280 degrees Fahrenheit and sunlight barely touches the crater floors. During development, it became clear the suit design needed larger oxygen tanks than the original specifications included. Not slightly large enough that the existing design failed to meet NASA-owned minimum emergency life support requirements. The threshold NASA sets for how long a suit must sustain an astronaut in an emergency, independent of any other system, was not being met. That triggered a redesign, which triggered structural revalidation, which triggered full recertification of the life support system. Each step takes months. The original Artemis III schedule had no margin for any of them. In the new plan, One of the primary objectives of the 2027 Earth orbit mission is to get these suits into a real microgravity environment, not a water tank simulation at Johnson Space Center, and test them against actual spacecraft interfaces. The data goes back into the design before anyone wears one on the lunar surface. Now, the heat shield. After Artemis I returned from its uncrewed test flight in 2022, engineers analyzing the capsule found something unexpected. The ablative material on the heat shield, the layer that burns away during re-entry to protect the crew from temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees, was showing degradation patterns that didn't match the engineering models, particularly during the more aggressive re-entry profiles required for missions returning from deep space rather than low Earth orbit. That is not a minor discrepancy. If the heat shield underperforms during a crewed lunar return, the astronauts don't survive re-entry. And this issue was identified 3 years before Artemis III was supposed to fly with no promine. NT public acknowledgement that it represented a significant unresolved uncertainty in the mission. Then came the Artemis II preparations. Valve pressurization issues. Helium flow problems echoing the same categories from Artemis I. At the time, Artemis III was being promoted to the public as an imminent crewed moon landing. The crew capsule assigned to carry those astronauts was still working through significant unresolved questions about its own behavior. This part comes directly from Scott Manley's engineering breakdown, and it rarely gets mentioned in mainstream coverage. After Artemis II returned, the SLS rocket's mobile launch platform, the massive structure that holds and supports the rocket during assembly and launch, sustained damage during the flight. The specific extent of that damage wasn't publicly detailed. But after Artemis I, the repairs and upgrades to the launch platform took approximately 2 years. If anything close to that timeline repeated for Artemis III, the 2027 launch window becomes extremely tight before the rocket even begins stacking. Here's the specific hardware chain Manley laid out. The solid rocket booster segments, the large solid fuel boosters that, strapped to the sides of the SLS core, were beginning to arrive at Kennedy Space Center by train in early 2025. Those would be among the first components stacked. The core booster itself was scheduled for rollout from the assembly facility around April 2025. But that core is only about 80% of the rocket. The aft section, the bottom of the rocket containing the RS-25 engines, was already at Kennedy, waiting to be mated. The 4 RS-25 engines were still being tested at Stenny Space Center in Mississippi and were expected to ship to Kennedy around July 2025. Only after they arrived could they be integrated onto the core. Only after integration could the full stack begin assembly in the Vehicle Assembly Building. For Artemis II, the core booster entered the VAB in December 2024. The rocket wasn't ready to fly until approximately a year later. To hit a mid-2027 launch for Artemis III, that integration timeline would need to be compressed significantly. Then there's the upper stage problem. And this one is genuinely strange. SLS uses an upper stage called the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, the ICPS. It's essentially a modified Delta IV upper stage. It was always called interim because the original plan was to eventually replace it with a much larger, more capable upper stage for deeper space missions. Here's the complication Manley identified. Since Artemis III is now staying in low Earth orbit, not going to the moon, the ICPS may not even be needed. The SLS core booster alone is powerful enough to get Orion into Earth orbit without the upper stage doing any meaningful work. If that's true, NASA could fly Artemis III without using the ICPS. They could save it for a future mission. But that creates another problem. The original plan only called for 3 Block 1s, LS rockets, in this configuration. If they save the ICPS for later and need a 4th rocket, someone has to build new hardware. The production line for the ICPS, which was based on the retired Delta IV rocket, has been shut down. The last one was finished in 2023. ULAS factory in Decatur, Alabama, has already been retooled for other purposes. There is one option Manley flagged. A structural test article built back in 2016. Same dimensions as the ICPS, structurally certified, but without an engine installed. It has been sitting in storage for nearly a decade. Whether it could be converted into a flight-worthy upper stage, and whether anyone wants to put a decades-old test article on a crewed rocket is a question NASA will need to answer. When Isaacman was asked about this directly, his response was notably open-ended. He suggested that NASA was still figuring out the exact Artemis III mission profile and that the ICPS decision hadn't been finalized. The mission, as of the announcement, was not fully defined. This is where the accountability question lives. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, is the independent watchdog that audits federal programs and reports to Congress. They had been tracking Artemis for years. Their reports consistently flagged the lander readiness timeline as a critical risk. They flagged the spacesuit development delays. They flagged the compounding danger of stacking multiple unproven systems onto a single deep space crewed mission. NASA's own Inspector General published the same findings through separate channels. These are public documents, available to anyone. The risks were named, quantified, and formally reported, not buried in classified briefings, not hidden from program leadership. And yet, the public facade, timeline held. The press releases described Artemis III as an imminent crewed lunar landing. The mission posters showed astronauts on the surface. There is also the Boeing dimension to this story because it connects directly to the leadership changes that followed the announcement. The Starliner program, Boeing's commercial crew vehicle, had been struggling for years, burning through cost overruns on a fixed-price contract. By Isaac Mann's own statement, NASA eventually declared the Starliner crew flight test a Type A mishap, a classification triggered when costs exceed $2 million. He said the actual figure was 100 times that. $200 million in mishap costs on a program that was supposed to demonstrate that commercial crew could work. The two astronauts assigned to Starliner's crewed test, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, ended up stranded on the International Space Station for months and had to return on a different spacecraft entirely. Within days of the Artemis restructuring announcement, NASA replaced the head of the Space Operations Mission Directorate and the head of the Commercial Crew Program. Both had their hands on the Starliner situation. Their deputies took over immediately, with a full internal review of NASA decision-making process underway. The message Isaacman sent was not subtle. The people who had been managing this program's relationship with reality were being held accountable for the gap between what was said publicly and what was actually true. Here's what actually changes. Artemis III launching in 2027 stays in low Earth orbit. The crew launches in Orion on SLS, rendezvous with one or both commercial landers in orbit, and spends the mission doing a comprehensive integrated checkout of everything. Life support systems running together in a real operational environment. Docking mechanisms tested between Orion and actual lander hardware, not simulators. Communications handoffs between Orion, Starship or Blue Moon, and mission control. Propulsion systems verified in flight. If the Axiom suits are ready, astronauts suit up in real microgravity and test EVA hardware against actual spacecraft interfaces for the first time. Everything that would otherwise be done for the first time on the surface of the moon, 240,000 miles from the nearest rescue, gets done here within hours of home. Steve Roby, ensign, the former NASA astronaut brought in to analyze the new mission, compared the docking challenge to circus performers on a flying trapeze, except done slowly, carefully, and with absolute precision. It has never been tested between Orion and a commercial lunar lander. That alone makes this an essential mission. If anything fails, a dock doesn't seal, a life support component drops out, a suit system misbehaves, the crew is a few hours from landing, not 250,000 miles from help with no options. All the data from that mission feeds into Artemis IV, targeting a real crewed lunar landing at the South Pole in early 2028. The South Pole is not just a symbolic destination. The permanently shadowed craters there are cold traps. They have preserved water ice for billions of years, water that engineers can electrolyze into hydrogen and oxygen, converting it into rocket propellant and breathable air. If humanity is ever going to build a permanent presence on the moon, not just visit, but actually stay, the South Pole's water ice is the resource base that makes it possible. After Artemis IV, NASA is targeting a second crewed surface mission by late 2028, Artemis V, and at least one surface landing every year after that, building incrementally toward a permanent lunar base. To make that cadence possible, SLS is being standardized. Same rocket configuration, every flight. No custom engineering on each vehicle. No transition to the planned heavier Block 1B variant. Just the same proven design, manufactured and stacked repeatedly tightening the launch gap from 3.5 years to 10 months. Boeing, Lockheed, SpaceX, Blue Origin, all major contractors were consulted before the announcement. Congress was briefed in advance. The response from SpaceX was measured but committed. They described wanting a *permanent sustainable presence* as quickly and safely as possible. Blue Origin's response was 2 words. *let's go. We're all in. Here is the honest version of this story. The original Artemis III moon landing was not a plan. It was a deadline dressed up as a plan. It named a date, assigned a mission, printed the posters, and left the hardest engineering problems as assumptions rather than solved requirements. The GAO said so in public reports. The Inspector General said so. Scott Manley said so, looking at the hardware. Eric Berger said, so looking at the program culture. The evidence was not hidden. What changed in 2025 wasn't the technical reality. The heat shield issue was identified in 2022. The lander readiness gap was visible the moment the contracts were signed. The spacesuit oxygen tank problem had been in development for years. The cadence problem has existed since Artemis I launched, and anyone with a calendar could do the math. What changed was that someone in charge decided to stop pretending. In a program with this much political pressure, where presidents have been announcing moon landing timelines for 35 years, and none of them have ever been met, choosing honesty over the appearance of progress is not nothing. Whether the new plan holds is a completely separate question. Whether the landers are actually ready by 2027. Whether the SLS cadence really compresses to 10 months. Whether Artemis IV lands at the South Pole in 2028 and begins building something permanent. Whether the ISEPS problem gets solved cleanly or becomes the next quiet crisis. Those answers are still being written. But the mission that was never going to work has been replaced by one that at least begins from an honest foundation. Ninth 52 years after Harrison Schmitt climbed that ladder and the moon went quiet. That foundation is the only real starting point there ever was. End card. The GAO flagged these exact problems as far back as 2021. So why did it take until 2025 to act? And do you think Artemis IV actually lands in 2028? Or does the pattern repeat? Tell me what you think below.